There are many variants of this story. You can hear it told in France and Switzerland and Germany and Austria. You can hear it told in Pakistan. Pakistan. But tonight, the version I'm telling is in English. And if you listen closely, you may hear a quote or even the storyline from Shakespeare's King Lear. Once upon a time, the world was very, very young and all kinds of amazing things happened. There was a very rich gentleman whose wife had died and left him with three lovely daughters, and he loved them very much. They were the apple of his eye. But one day he wanted to find out how much they loved him. So he said to the eldest daughter, "How much do you love me, my dear?" And she said, quick as a wink, "As much as the world besides." "Oh, that's wonderful," he said, and he gave her a kiss. Then he turned to the second daughter and he said, "How much do you love me, my dear?" And she said, quick as a wink, "As much as life itself." "Oh, good," he said, and he patted her on the cheek. Then he turned to his youngest daughter, who's also the prettiest and whom he really loved the most. "How much do you love me, my dear?" Well, this girl, she was not only beautiful, but she was clever, and she thought a moment and she said, "I love you as much as fresh meat loves salt." "What? If that is what you give me for all I have given you?" he said, very angry. "Out you go." And then and there, he put her out of house and home where she had been born and raised, and bam, shut the door right in her face. Well, she was very upset. And she began to wander. And she wandered on, and she wandered on, crying until she came to a great fen where the reeds grew and blew in the breeze, and the rushes just rustled like a field of corn with wind coming through it. She sat down and she began to plait herself an overall to put over her fine clothes and a cap to match. For being a clever girl, she realized that in this lonely country, that a robber might come along and he might kill her for her fine clothes and for her jewels. So she sat and she plaited, and it took a long time. And as she sat, she sang a little song. "Hide my hair, O cap of rushes. Hide my heart, O robe of rushes. Sure my answer had no fault. I love him more than he loves salt." And the little birds in the fen sat and they listened to her and they sang back to her. "Cap of rushes, shed no tear. Robe of rushes, have no fear. With these words, if fault he find, sure your father must be blind." When her task was finished, she put on her robe of rushes, and it hid all of her fine clothes, and the cap hid all of her beautiful golden hair, so that she looked quite the common country girl. But the fen birds sang as they flew away. "Cap of rushes we can see, robe of rushes what you be, fair and clean and fine and tidy, so you'll be whate'er betide ye." By this time she was very, very hungry, and she wandered on and on, but she didn't come to either cottage or hamlet. And at sunsetting, she came to a fine big house right at the edge of the fen. It had a beautiful wooden carved door, but mindful of her dress, she went around to the back, and there she found a strapping fat scullion washing pots and pans, and the woman had a very sulky look on her face. Being a clever girl, she figured out what the maid wanted, and she said, "Oh, hello there. If you will give me a night's lodging, I will wash those pots and pans for you." "Why, here's luck," said the scullion. "I was just wanting to step out and walk about with my sweetheart, and here you are. Yes, yes, I will share my bed with you and even give you a bite of my supper if you will finish these pots and pans, but mind you, they better be clean or cook will come after me." Well, the next morning, The saucepans have been scraped so that they looked brand new, and the pots shone like silver. The cook called for the scullion and said, "Who washed these pots? Not you, I'll swear." Well, the scullion maid had to up and out with the truth, and the cook was ready to put her out and take the new one on, but the latter one said, "No, no, no. She gave me a night's lodging. She was kind to me. And if you like, I will stay without wages and do the dirty work for her." So Caporushes, which is what they called her because she would not give her real name, she stayed on and she scrubbed the pots and she scoured the pans. Now the young master of the house came of age. And to celebrate this, they decided to give a ball to the whole neighborhood because he was a very fine dancer. He liked nothing better than a good country measure. And it was to be a very fine party. And after supper was served, the servants could go up to the gallery of the ballroom and watch the quality down below having a good time. The Caporushes decided not to go, for you see, she also was a very fine dancer, and she knew that if she heard those fiddles fiddling, she would want to be up and dancing. So when the others went down to the gallery, she crept on up to her bed. But alas and alack, someone had left the door open, and when she heard the fiddlers fiddling and the tramp of dancing feet, she couldn't bear it. She upped and offed with her cap and her gown of rushes, and in a trice she was down in the ballroom, joining in a merry jig. And people looked at her, for she was dressed so beautifully, and her hair all dressed with milky white pearls, and she was gorgeous. Well, the young master singled her out at once, and with a very elaborate bow, he came and asked her to be his partner for the evening. And so they danced on through the evening. He couldn't take his eyes off of her, but she kept her counsel and didn't tell him her name. She made up an excuse of some sort, and before the end of the ball, she slipped off and she was back in bed, dressed in the cap and the gown of rushes before the servants came up. She pretended to be asleep and they went on to bed. But the next morning, oh, the stories they told. "Oh, you should have seen her," they said. "She was beautiful, dressed in such a gorgeous gown, and her hair all dressed with lovely pearls. No one knew where she came from. Everyone was agog trying to find out." "Oh," said Cap of Rushes, with a twinkle in her eye, "I should have liked to have known who she was and to have seen her, but I probably never will." "Oh, yes, you will, for tonight the young master has ordered another ball, and he's hopeful that she will come, for he thinks she is so fine." Well, that night, Cap of Rushes, she didn't go either. She stayed in her room, and she thought to herself, "I can't go." And then the fiddle started and the dancing started. And she thought to herself, "Just one dance. I must dance with young master once more because he's such a fine dancer." So she upped and she offed with the cap and the robe of rushes. And there she was, all fine and tidy. Well, she didn't even have to brush her beautiful golden hair. And as she came down the stairs, there he was at the door waiting for her, for he had determined that he would not dance with anyone but her. He took her by the hand and off they went down the ballroom. Beautiful. But she kept her own counsel and didn't tell him who she was. She slipped away from the ball again and just barely made it up the stairs and into the cap and robe of rushes and into bed when the others came. She pretended to be asleep, but her cheeks were flushed and she was breathing fast. And they looked at her and they said, "Oh, she's dreaming. We hope those are happy dreams." And the next morning, all they could say was how beautiful the young master was, how beautiful was the young stranger, how beautiful was the dancing and her dress. Oh, law, just beautiful. But who is she? And Caporushes, with a twinkle in her eye and a smile on her face, said, "I should like to have seen her too, but I never will." "You have one more chance," they said, "for young master has ordered still one more ball in hopes that she will come. And he just could not take his eyes off of her last night, and you could tell that he's madly in love with her. Well, that night, Caporushes stayed in her room again for the third time, and she thought to herself, it's unseemly for the young master to dance with the scullery maid. I just can't go down. I will not go down. She steeled herself, and then the music began. And then the music began, and she found herself down there again, dancing with him. He didn't take his eyes off of her, and he implored her to tell him her name, but she kept her own counsel. And she said, she must never, never, never come and dance again. She must go away and he must forget her, say goodbye. And he said, oh, no, no. And he grasped her by the hand and he held her hand so tight that she had quite a job getting it free. And when she did, his ring came off. And as she fled upstairs to the bedroom, she saw it there in her hand. And she just barely got into bed, and the cap and the robe of rushes, and the servants came running in, and she was, oh, you woke me up coming up the stairs, she said for an excuse. Oh, no, not we, they said. The whole house is in an uproar. They're looking for the young stranger. The young master says he must find her, and if he doesn't, he'll die of love for her. Oh, Caporushes burst out laughing. Young men don't die of love. He'll find someone else. But he didn't. He spent all of his time looking for her. He looked high, he looked low, and no matter where he went or to whom he spoke, no one knew anything about her. And day by day, as he looked, he stopped eating and he grew thinner and thinner and thinner, and he grew paler and paler and paler until finally he took to his bed. Now the housekeeper went down to the cook and said, please fix the most delicious dinner for the young master, for he will eat nothing. And the cook prepared soups and chilies and creams and roast chicken and bread sauce, and the young master would have none of it. And then the housekeeper came down to the cook. This time she was crying and she said, please prepare for young master some gruel. Perhaps he will eat that, for he's truly about to die. He's about to die for love of the young stranger. And if she could see him now, she would surely have pity on him. Well, Cap of Russia stopped scraping the pots and she listened. The cook began to prepare the gruel, and Cap of Rushes got up and came over to her and said, let me stir it while you get a cup from the pantry room. And she stirred the gruel, and when the cook was getting the cup, she slipped the master's ring into the cup, and the cup came back. She poured the gruel into it. The butler took it upstairs on the silver salver, and when he brought it into the room, the young master waved it away. The butler, seeing that young master was truly near death, began to cry and implored him, please take just a taste. And the young master said, very well. And he took the silver spoon and he stirred the gruel, and there was something hard down in it. And he fished it out, and lo, it was his ring. This strengthened him, and he sat up in bed and he said to the butler, who prepared this? And the butler said, well, the cook, of course. And the young master said, send her up here. And the cook came up and he said, who cooked this? And she said, if it please you, sir, I did. And she was half pleased and also half frightened. And he looked at her and he looked her up and he looked her down. And he looked her down and he looked her up and he said, you didn't do it. You're too stout. Now, who prepared this? Well, the cook began to cry, and she said, if it please you, sir, I cooked it, but Caporushes, she stirred it. Caporushes? Said young master. Who is Caporushes? The cook began to whimper. She's the scullion, sir. Oh, the young man sighed and he fell back on his pillows and he said in a tiny little voice, because he was so weak and near death, send Caporushes here. And when she came, he looked at her, and the cap And in the gown of rushes, he saw a common country girl, and he turned his face to the wall. But as he did, he said in a faint little voice, "From whom did you get my ring?" Caporushes looked at him, and she saw how weak he was and how worn with love for her, and her heart melted. And she said, "From him who gave it to me," in a soft little voice. And then she offed the cap, she offed the robe of rushes. They all fell to the ground. And there she stood in her beautiful dress, and her hair dressed with pearls, her beautiful golden hair, all fine and clean and neat and tidy as could be. And he saw this out of the tail end of his eye, whipped his head around, looked at her. "It is you," grabbed her and gave her a big kiss. Well, so now they were to be married. It was to be the biggest, finest wedding, and people in the neighborhood were invited from far and from near to come. And on the invitation list was Caporushes' old father, who had declined in health since she left. And when she left, he had lost his sight, and he was very dim and very miserable. But since he was a friend of the family, he bucked up and he came on anyway. What a feast it was going to be. Caporushes went to her friend the cook and said, "Prepare every dish without a mite of salt." "Oh, well, that'll be rare and tasty," said the cook, laughing. But since she loved Caporushes for having stirred the gruel and brought young master back to life, she agreed to it, and every dish had not one mite of salt. Well, the company sat down at the table to dine, and their faces were smiling and full of content because every dish just looked so fine and tasty. But as they began to eat, their faces fell and the smiles dropped, and for not a single dish had one mite of salt. Caporushes' old father, whom she had seated beside her, began to cry and weep. "Why, what is wrong?" Caporushes asked him. "Oh," he said, "I once had a daughter. It was my youngest daughter. I loved her dearly, dearly. And one day I asked her how much she loved me. And she said, as much as fresh meat loves salt. And I became very angry, and I put her out of house and home and shut the door bang in her face because I thought she loved me not at all. But now I understand, and I see that she loved me the greatest of all of my daughters." And as he said these words, his eyes were miraculously opened, and he looked, and there she was, his daughter, lovelier than ever. And Caporushes began to laugh, and she took her father's hand, and she took the hand of her husband, the young master, and laughing, she said, "I love you both as fresh meat loves salt." And after that, they all lived happily on.